welcome to my channel Huskal. Today we are going to make an historical epoxy, also known as Cutlers resin. With this we are going to glue these two medieval broadhead arrow points onto two arrow shafts that I have prepared. And one of the reasons why it's good to use this kind of pine resin based glue is because it does harden and become almost as good as modern epoxy, but you can also heat it up afterwards to about 120 degrees Celsius, and you can get your broadheads off your shafts if the shaft breaks. And we do know that historically this kind of glue and adhesives have been used for all of history up until modern times. We know this because in hilts and handles of Viking era seaxes and swords and such we have found pine resin. So what we are going to make this glue out of is pine resin, charcoal that we are going to grind into a powder, and some beeswax. And the reason we are going to use the beeswax is to make the glue a little bit softer, because this glue is pretty brittle, and as you can imagine, when you shoot arrows into well, targets or animals or anything like that, it needs to be a little bit more shock absorbent than the pine resin is as it is now. I don't know if you can see it, but it cracks if I press on it, and that is simply too brittle. But first we need to make a fire. Alright, so now that the fire has died down a bit and we have like this bed of charcoal, we have a much more workable and usable fire source or heat source. So what we are going to do now is we are going to heat up the pine resin until it melts, but we really need to be careful that we do not overheat it, because that will ruin the glue and make it much too brittle. So we'll just place it around here, and then here we have some charcoal. The best charcoal for this appliance is some kind of hardwood charcoal, so no conifer tree, no pine, no spruce, preferably oak or maple, and the proportions here should be around 4 parts pine resin, 1 part charcoal, and 1 part beeswax. So now we need to crush this up so it becomes a nice fine powder to make a good glue. You can just use the pole of an axe or a rock or something like that, but really make it into a fine powder, because you don't want chunks of charcoal in your glue when you glue your arrowheads. Alright, so as you can see here, the charcoal is a nice fine powder now, but we should wait until the pine resin has melted properly with mixing it in. So just make sure that the pine resin melts and heats somewhat evenly. Okay, so now we are going to take our beeswax. As you can see here, I have beeswax granules, but you can use any natural beeswax. And try to think about the proportions. So you have like 4 parts pine resin, 1 part beeswax, 1 part charcoal. Because if you have too much beeswax, the glue will not solidify properly. And it is actually this beeswax here that makes the glue less brittle and more suitable for arrowheads or spearheads. And fighting knives, of course. So just take a stick or something and mix it all together. And keep the heat up. And try to do this slowly, the heating part, so you don't overheat any side, and so that you give the beeswax good time to melt. And maybe you can see here what it looks like now. From this almost amber-like pine resin, we have gotten this thick black tar-like substance, and this is exactly what we want. This tar-like substance, this is the glue, and it's also extremely flammable, so make sure that you don't set it on fire. And naturally there are a lot of different recipes for this kind of glue, different proportions. And if you want to do a somewhat more modern glue that holds up very good, don't use charcoal, use powdered bricks. You know, the red brick that has red ochre in it. A lot of modern knife smiths that want a historical touch actually uses that kind of glue. Another thing that you can do is you can to make the glue stick a little bit better, we will not do this today, you can actually mix in some animal shit. And good shit to use would be rabbit poop or deer poop. Just make sure that the animal that you take the feces from isn't meat eater. You only use herbivore, so you get like this fibrous material. Alright, so it looks about done. It is a good idea to give it a little bit more time, just to make sure that the beeswax has melted in properly. I'm going to take another couple of granules of beeswax in it, just to make sure that it doesn't become too brittle, this glue. And now we are ready to glue our arrows. So what you want to do naturally is to prepare your arrow shafts so that your arrows fit nice and snugly, and make sure that they are on straight. And a little trick, this is the same kind of trick as when you're hafting a spear. If you can wiggle it that way, like this way, you need to shave off wood this way. So if you can wiggle it this way, shave off wood this way. And the end result, you shouldn't be able to wiggle it at all, and it's supposed to be straight, because if the arrowhead isn't really straight, it will not fly well. So what we are going to do is just dip the arrow shaft into the glue. Make sure the portion that you're going to glue is good and saturated, as you can see here. Just get it really in there. And then we push the arrowhead on. Push it on real nice. And some will stick out, some of the glue. Just even it out a bit. And when it has dried later, you can fix it up so it looks a little bit nicer. And a good thing about using this kind of glue for arrowheads is that this glue is totally waterproof. You can even waterproof other stuff with pine resin. So we're going to let this cool off, and this needs to cure for about a week before we can use the arrow. So now we're just going to glue on the other arrowhead. Just get a lot of glue in there. Right. And if you have arrows with a tang instead of this, I don't know what you would call it, hylsa, you would have to use another technique where you split the shaft in a good way, but you would also use this kind of glue. The difference would be that you would have to use sinew or some good string material to wrap around the shaft and the arrow, the arrowhead, and then just set it with more glue. Alright, so now we have our two arrowheads. We may want to just make sure that the glue gets a little bit, that you get a little bit glue lower than the actual arrowhead, just to make sure that everything holds up properly. And as I said, we can make this look a little bit nicer later when the glue has cured. And the nice part about making a little bit more glue than you need is you can make fire sticks out of it, the glue. So you can take a good stick and then you can just dip it in here like you're dipping a candle, letting it solidify. You could actually dip that in water and then get more glue on it. And after a while you will get this ball of glue on here, and you can heat it up and use it later. You can also use these sticks to make a fire as a tinder, because this, as I said earlier, is extremely flammable. But the rest of the glue we will save for future projects, and also to make another arrow at home to my friend Ulle, who is a little Viking warrior that lives around here, who needs himself a couple of arrows. So we're going to save this to make Ulles arrow later at home. Tack så mycket. Ha en bra dag.